So within those studies that they would produce, they're working with very limited information about the culture that they're studying. So they don't know the language, they don't know the customs, they don't know very much about the culture that they're studying, but they're going down there to study this culture and then produce a level of knowledge about this culture. So they'll go down with their limited information and then they'll try to make sense of the cultural nuances or the cultural norms, right? And oftentimes when that happens, they're misrepresenting the culture that they're studying, right? They're going to bring their biases and their prejudices, and they're going to view the culture that they're studying by what their culture does, right? So I'm a European from Britain. I'm going to go into South America to study the Incas, but I'm going to judge the Incas by what the British do in Britain, right? So the Incas are uncivilized because in Britain we drink tea and we wear full clothes and we wear these wigs. The Incas don't do that, so they're uncivilized, right? So we're basing the values and the importance of certain cultural nuances based on my culture, not the culture that I'm studying, okay? So this is the science behind anthropology. So Zora Hurst is a trained anthropologist. Let's see. Yeah, so we'll go into what I found of interest, and then we'll kind of finish with some of the points of emphasis of Zora Hurston. So think about what the class is, think about what we've covered so far. Think of the class of somewhat as a genealogy, right? Like a traveling history. So we started off in the continent of Africa with African concepts like Ma'at, right? We traveled to the Caribbean and engaged the works of thinkers like Césaire. We engaged thinkers like Lisant, who has placed us in the open boat as we traveled across the Atlantic. Now we're situating ourselves on American soil, right? And this book is a study of folklore, right? It's an autobiographical study. So these stories that she's depicting are real conversations that real people had from her hometown, right? So that's where the autobiographical component comes in. But again, this is an anthropological study, so she's going back to her hometown to study the people from her hometown, okay? So we're dealing with this notion of the oral tradition. We're dealing with this notion of language, right? So if you think about what we read, or actually what we watched last week as it pertains to Ryan Coogler and how he chose to use his Oakland accent juxtaposed to trying to sound professional in interviews. If you think about Ngugi and his problem with the colonial language, this text takes up that same issue, but in a very subtle way. And I'm sure if you guys noticed when you read this, it's written and it sounds quite different than anything we've read so far, right? It's written in a very broken English, what they may call a pidgin English. That is also a methodological move that Hurston is doing as it pertains to this idea or this notion of language, right? The idea or the notion of telling, of lying, and of and how that pertains to the oral tradition. So the things that are spoken, right? So when you tell something, you're speaking. Even telling a lie is something that's spoken, right? And if you look at the opening page, 131, it starts off with that, with those words, right? Y'all been telling and lying, right? So this idea of telling is important, right? There's something significant to that. What is folklore? Because this is a book, is her documenting folklore from the Caribbean, folklore from New Orleans, and folklore from Florida, right? So what is this notion of folklore? Why is that significant? I don't know if you guys noticed, but a lot of the telling was being done by the elders, and then they referred to the elders as dad, right? In the African tradition, you would call them Baba, right? So my father-in-law, I don't refer to him as my father-in-law. I refer to him as Baba, as father, right? When I do rites of passage for young men in San Bernardino, ages 10 through 17, they refer to me as Baba Amiri because I assume a father figure for them, right? So in an African context, anyone who is an elder who you should show respect to, you refer to them as Baba. And you see that play out in the work of Zora Hurston, but they use the word dad. They refer to these gentlemen as dad, right? And then also that situates these individuals, these dads, as the role of griot, right? And the griot is the person responsible for telling the oral stories of the community in African tradition. Okay. And then we have this, the story of the bear, the lion, and the king, right? And these are stories of subversion. Do you guys know what I mean by subversion, or what I mean if I were to say to undermine authority? Does those terms make sense to you? Okay, so subversion and to undermine, right? So if we were to think about the enslavement experience, and in the enslaved experience, oftentimes there were either sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, or cotton plantations, right? So you would be tasked to come home with a certain amount of cotton, with a certain amount of sugar, with a certain amount of tobacco. And the enslaved Africans would do things to be subversive, right? They would maybe move slower than what the overseers would want them to do, right? If an enslaved African is working in the kitchen and they are tasked to provide food to these enslavers, right? They may steal some of the food that they cook and give it to their children, right? That's being subversive, that's being undermining, right? There is there's a story of a gentleman who was enslaved and he wanted his freedom. So what he did was he got a human or a life-size box, packed himself in that box, wrote the shipping address somewhere in New York, and literally mailed himself to freedom in New York, right? So that's a subversive tactic to undermine the authority of the enslaved institution, right? So when you read those stories of the lion, the bear, and John, they're stories of subversiveness, right? How can you use your intelligence to outsmart the authority? That's what they're trying to get you to think about. Then we have the story about how to eat fish. What's the significance of the knowledge being passed down? He talks about how to eat fish, how to warm yourself when you've been out in the cold at night, right? So what's the significance of those stories? And thinking about that as knowledge being passed down from one generation to the next. I talked about that. I talked about the wind. And then also she ends the chapter with a story or a sermon from the preacher, right? So what's the significance of the story from the preacher? The stories of how to eat fish, and then the stories of how to warm yourself and things of that nature. What's important about that? So this book was published in 1935. Again, it's an autobiographical text, collection of folklore. So these books and these stories took place in Eatonville and Polk County, Florida, as well as New Orleans. I mentioned she's a anthropologist. She studied under Franz Boas. Now, Franz Boas is considered the father of American anthropology, right? So her mentor was the architect of anthropology as it pertains to the Americas, right? So she is a very highly skilled and highly trained anthropologist. She got her AA from she got her AA from Howard, and then got her BA from Barnard College of Women's College of Columbia, and then in anthropology, and then she studied anthropology for her graduate studies at the University of Columbia under Franz Boas. Again, her research is folklore, but folklore from the Caribbean, and then folklore produced by Africans in the Americas. So we've talked about theoretical frameworks throughout the semester. Theoretical frameworks become very important because our midterm is approaching, right? We're going to have 5 questions. You're going to have to answer 3 of those 5 questions. But each time that you answer a question, you must use a theoretical framework to earn the full points, right? And the theoretical frameworks that we covered so far are counter storytelling, or the counter narrative. That's the first theoretical framework. African American male theory, which states that African people are resistant and resilient with an innate capacity for brilliance. So that's our second theoretical framework. And then our final theoretical framework, which is really situated in the reading today, is the idea of funds of knowledge, right? So how knowledge gets passed down in communities from one generation to the next, how knowledge is passed down in families from one generation to the next, is this idea of funds of knowledge. This idea or this theoretical framework is a challenge to the work of Pierre Bourdieu, who was a French philosopher. And he had this idea, and he was trying to understand why certain communities are successful and why certain communities are not. And he says cultural capital is the source of certain communities' success. So things like being able to go to the arts and go to the museums and go see art, right? Things like if your son plays sports and your son is on the soccer team, his teacher's son may be on the very same soccer team. So that allows you and the teacher to build rapport, right? So now the teacher is going to interact with your son in a slightly different, just because they have a familiarity, right? So Bourdieu states that this is a cultural capital that allows them to be successful. So the author of Funds of Knowledge argues, well, this cultural capital always plays out in a European context, right? These are things that white folks say that are important, right? But there's all this whole other form of knowledge that takes place within these communities that don't get recognized that are also important, right? Your parents teaching you how to make injera, which is an East African dish, right? That's a forms of knowledge that gets passed down. Your parents teach you guys teaching how to make tamales, enchiladas, things of that nature. Those are funds of knowledge that gets passed down from generation to generation. That is important, right? In the Black community, it's a popular saying that you have to be twice as good. And what that means is when you're going for opportunities, for job opportunities, to applying to grad school programs, your application has to be twice as good as the other people who you're applying against, just because you're not going to get the same opportunities that they're going to get, right? So it does no good for you to get B's or C's if you're Black. You have to get A's because that's the only way you'll get your foot in the door, right? So that's the funds of knowledge that my mom told me, that her mom told her, and her mom told her, right? So it's a generational knowledge that's passed down from generation to generation. So this is this idea of funds of knowledge. So this is a theoretical framework that you're expected to work through as it pertains to your midterm and whatever else that you have to turn in. It's just a way to get the reader or to get your audience to think about what you want them to think about, right? It's a pathway to understanding. So that's our theoretical framework for today. And this reading is situated in that theoretical framework of funds of knowledge. So before we break into breakout groups, is there any questions that you guys have as it pertains to the reading? Okay.
There were a couple of terms that I had trouble understanding. Is there like a certain website or somewhere we could go to be able to translate those words?
Yeah, so let me ask you this, Cecilia. Did you read the book out loud or did you read it to yourself?
To myself.
Yeah, so oftentimes, especially with it written like this, if you were to read it out loud and just hear what you think it is, it will make sense, because it's not like it's a different, trying to think how to explain this to you. It's not like it's a different word with a different meaning. It's a different pronunciation of the word. So,
Right.
yeah. So for example, if we're looking at page, the first page, right? And I'm going to the third paragraph, and it starts with course. It says, course, I agree, right? So essentially what you're saying is, of course, I agree.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So I'm assuming that a lot of these words, it's not like a definition that you're not familiar with. It's just pronounced in a way that's unfamiliar.
Yeah, what I was referring more to was just like certain terms. One of them that I wrote down was like bootlegger,
Okay.
juke, terms of that nature.
Okay, so a bootlegger, right? So when there was a time where alcohol was illegal, right?
Yeah.
And a bootlegger would be somebody who was able to get illegal alcohol and sell it to people. Think about, I don't know, you guys may be too young for this, but back in the day they had CD men, right? So if you had a CD or a DVD, there would be somebody who would come to the barbershop, they'll be selling them on the corner. And there'll be bootleg CDs, right? They're illegal CDs that somebody either went into the movie theater, recorded that shit, and then they put it on a CD themselves and they're selling it, right? So it's the same concept. It's just selling illegal contraband, right? But in this case, it pertains to liquor. The juke. So y'all probably too young for this too. It stems from this term, the jukebox, right? So you put a quarter in that motherfucker and they'll play some music, right? So the juke is like what we call the club today. I don't know if y'all go to clubs, but it's the club, right? It's a discotheque. It's where you party, you dance, and you gather and you know, drink and have fun, right? Were there any other terms that you could think of off top, Cecilia?
Um, I can't pronounce this, so I'm just gonna spell it out.
Okay.
Useterbe.
What page?
Um, Sorry, I think it was one of the first few pages, but I can check.
Okay. I think that's one of the words that's not a word. They just kind of wrote that shit weird.
One of the pronunciations.
Yeah.
Okay. Then I can take a look at it and go back and review it
Okay.
then. But other than that, that was it. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Anybody else have any other questions as it pertains to the reading before we go into the breakout groups? Okay. Does anybody have a definition for the term folklore? Okay, that's good. So this is what you're going to discuss in your breakout groups. One, I want you guys to come up with a definition for folklore. So when we come back together as a class, each group should be able to define folklore, okay? Also in your groups, and this is why you should have your journals handy, we're going to discuss what you guys wrote in your journal. So one of the questions, if you will, is what is Hurston's thesis and what is her method, right? So what is she arguing, or what is she trying to get the reader to understand? And then what is her method? And Cecilia's question deals with method and the way that it's written. She used a certain type of dialect, right? That becomes important. So that should come up in you guys' conversation. Do you find that method was effective? So did it help you make sense of the reading, or did it make it more confusing for you, right? So that's one topic of conversation that should be discussed in your group. Another thing that should be discussed is your analysis. So how did you make sense of what you read, right? And then the final point of conversation should be how did you make sense of this reading as it pertains to what's going on today, right? So did anything that you read make you think about something that's going on in the world right now? So those should be your conversation points as it pertains to your breakout groups. One, coming up with a working definition of what is folklore. Two, what is Hurston's thesis, and does her method work, right? Does it make the reading more confusing, or does it make it more clear? Three, what is your analysis of the reading? How did you make sense of what you read? And finally, what did you tie this reading to what's going on in the modern world? So how did you tie that to the contemporary? Does everybody understand those questions? Anybody need me to clarify those questions? I'm going to give you guys about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll come back together and we'll discuss as a group. Again, please assign a spokesperson that will kind of echo your group's conversation. But although we have these spokespersons, it does not mean that everyone else is off the hook. Everybody should be engaged in the conversation, right? Let's see. So we'll have 4 rooms, so we've got 3 to 4 people per room. Any last minute questions? All right. Jocelyn, you all right? You guys should be in your breakout rooms now.
I don't see the thing.
You don't see it? Let me see.
No, sorry about that.
Okay. Because it shows that you have the option to accept. It just shows that you haven't joined it. Hold on, let me try something else.
Wait, I see it. I see it. It's
okay. Okay, cool. All right. So we had 3 groups. I don't know who's the spokesman person for each group. But for group 1, I know Miracle was in the group. Again, she may not be the spokesperson. Group 2, actually, I'm sorry, you have 4 groups. Group 2 was Douglas's group. Douglas may not be the spokesperson, but whoever was in his group, that spokesperson was assigned for group 2. Yaneli's group is group 3. She may not be the spokesperson, but just know whoever was in her group that's been assigned a spokesperson is for group 3. And then Jocelyn's group is group 4. And again, she may not be the spokesperson, but whoever's in that group, just know that you're the spokesperson. So we'll start with group 1. Again, Miracle was in the group. She may not be the spokesperson, but whoever was assigned the spokesperson for Miracle group, it's on you.
So I am the spokesperson. We only got to answer 3 of them,
Okay.
but I'm not sure if this is exactly how you wanted the questions to be answered, but for the thesis, we thought that the author's main point in this chapter of Mules and Men was that she wanted the reader to understand the mythology and history of hoodoo and the connection to being Black in the 1930s period. Sorry. She gave the perspective of the everyday lives that really inspire the communication and imagination as the storytellers really take us through the ordinary with the legendary. They gave us the creation to create an exchange of folk narratives that really describe some of the aspects of the systems, beliefs, and social structures in that society during the time. We said that the definition of folklore was really story-based, that was passed down from generation, that has a deeper understanding of the subculture and oral traditions. And as for analysis, we thought that throughout reading this chapter, you were really able to hear the dialectical change of the different voices and perspectives of the words being spoken. There was a lot of the storytelling which lets you see the images throughout the people's lives. And we notice the connection between Genesis 2:21, which was a Bible verse, and how Christianity was connected with the cultural aspect during that time. And we thought the story can be connected to today because throughout today's society, a lot of the cultures have myths and folk tales that are passed down from generation to generation.
Absolutely. And then Miracle, did you guys discuss far as did you feel her method was effective or ineffective?
We didn't discuss that, but yeah.
Would it just off for your personal opinion, did you find her method to be effective or ineffective?
I thought her method was effective. I think everyone is able to connect to it, and it really gave us a better understanding of the culture and just of folklores and communication and what she's trying to entail.
So thank you. So group 2 was Douglas's group. Douglas, you may not have been the spokesperson, but whoever you guys assigned for that group, it's on you.
So we only got to we're still discussing about the thesis because all of us in the group, we really didn't know what the thesis was. So we were discussing more on definition of folklore and how something like traditions are passed down generations, like myths and certain aspects of any activities passed down to generation to generation. And But the thesis, we had a harder time because we all had a hard time understanding the reading. And
So,
yeah, that was all we got to.
So Douglas, have you guys all had a hard time understanding the reading? And again, this could be your personal opinion, maybe not the opinion of your overall group. As it pertains to her method, do you think that the hard time that you guys had with the reading was due to the method, the way that it was written?
Honestly, yeah, it kind of was. It was a different like type of like, it was like kind of like southern like type of English, like Louisiana type.
Yeah.
And I was getting like really confused in the beginning, and then towards the end, as I kept reading, I started understanding more or less though.
Yeah. So that's a very good point, Douglas. So, and I think what you're speaking to, without even knowing that you're speaking to it, there's a rhythm to her writing, and so I read the whole book, and you're absolutely right. So as far as like the first 2 chapters, I'm reading the book like, what the fuck am I reading, right? And keep in mind, like I'm familiar with Southern culture. My grandparents are from Oklahoma, right? I spent some time in Tennessee, so like I know Southern dialect, but I'm a California motherfucker, like to the core, right? So it's hard for me to understand that. Even when I was in Tennessee, I was struggling because people would talk to me and I'm looking at them like, what are you asking, right? So I get the complexity and the opacity of the reading. But what I found as I got about halfway through the book, and reading out loud helps, I start to get the rhythm of the language and the rhythm of the flow of how she's writing the book and why she's writing the book. Also, and even in my preparation for the course today, I read that chapter like 3 times, right? I read it just one time just for my read, then I read it before class on Tuesday, and then I read it before class today. So on that third read, a lot more things became clear than on the first 2 prior reads. So it's also a idea of struggling with the book, right? Engaging the book multiple times. You can't just really expect to read it once and have it all, right? So that really brings up a good point. I'm going to touch back to your guys's inability to find a thesis, but I'm going to do that after the other 2 groups go, because there's a point to that as well. So group 3 was Yaneli's group. I don't know if Yaneli is the spokesperson, but whoever you guys assigned for that group, it's on you.
All right, so I'm actually the spokesperson. So our definition for folklore that we came up with in our own words was vocal storytelling that reveals culture and beliefs that is passed down through generations. And then for our thesis, we said the demonstration of African folklore to give insight to people of other cultures, as well as provide a new perspective. So for our analysis, at first we were a little bit confused because we didn't know whether to place like the culture in to relation to today's society or as analysis, but we decided to say analysis just because even back then, you know, every single culture was doing its own thing, right? So what we kind of compared to was like, there are some cultures that don't eat pork, you know, and then there's like Catholicism, I'm pretty sure it was around even back then too, where certain days meat isn't eaten. Right. So that's kind of what we got for our analysis. And then for in relation to today's society, we said that with the older generations teaching the younger generations how to cook certain foods, that is definitely still seen today, such as the example you provided earlier with the tamale making. You know, personally, I find myself doing that on Christmas every single year. And then another perspective that we did give in relation to today's society is sometimes things tend to change. For example, like the younger generations might have new ideas that they incorporate. So, you know, even though traditions are passed down, there's going to be, you know, times where they are kind of tweaked a little bit just because of new ideas or being influenced from others or even society.
Oh, good job, you guys. So the final group was Jocelyn's group. She may not be the spokesperson, but whoever was assigned to be the spokesperson for group 4.
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did end up being the spokesperson, and we decided that Folklore is a traditional belief and stories or tales that are passed down through generations orally, and that the thesis of Mules and Men's was made for those who are unfamiliar with African folklore, and she helps introduce the culture to give a better understanding. And her method was effective, and it seems like this was a group of people talking to you like casually, like one to one, and made it feel like you were right there sitting before them, and that the purpose of this was written to expand an audience. The purpose of this was written to help an audience who did not know about African culture or folklore learn more about it, especially in a time when the culture and just the world knowing that Africa existed was expanding and being explored upon.
Not, that's perfect. Okay, so I want to kind of circle back to Douglas, right? Because he brought up a point, and actually on Tuesday in Group A's conversation, hold on, on Tuesday's conversation, the same point was brought up around this question of thesis. And what they said on Tuesday was she doesn't have a thesis. There is no concrete thesis that you could pull from the chapter. And to be honest with you, I'm inclined to agree. Although, groups 1, 3, and 4, you guys produced the thesis, and you're absolutely right in the production of your thesis as it pertains to the entire book, right? So it's pretty impressive that you guys were able to extract that without reading the entire book. But if we are to focus on just this chapter that was read, I couldn't say that there's a concrete thesis that is prevalent throughout the entire chapter. At best, each story may present a thesis, but I'm kind of inclined to agree with Douglas and his group that there is no real thesis. And again, not to say that everyone who provided a thesis is wrong, but concretely, there's not one thing that you could pull and say from that chapter and say that this is what she's arguing, right? But, you brought up a good point, Jocelyn, in the sense that actually Jocelyn and Miracle brought up a good point, and that's the point of the quotidian, right? The daily experiences of the people who she's studying, right? So you get to get placed into the daily lives of Black folks in Florida and Black folks in New Orleans in the 1920s and 1930s, right? And she does a very good job of placing you there. And part of the reason that there is no thesis is because she is taking you to that time and place, right? So it would be the equivalent of us going to the club, right? You got your phone and you're gonna just record the conversation that you hear in the club. That shit's gonna sound random, right? Because each group that you go to is gonna be talking about something different, right? And then out of nowhere, a preacher appears in the club and he just starts giving a sermon, right? So there is not gonna be that continuity in a thesis because she's pulling from everyone and everything, right? But that adds to the method. And while I agree with Douglas that the way that it's written, it doesn't make it as clear as we may want it to be, but from a methodological standpoint, it's flawless, right? Because she's kind of doing the same thing. She's kind of struggling with the same thing that Malidoma Patrice Somé is struggling with, in the sense of, how do I write this African story in an English language, right? So she cannot tell the story that she's seeking to tell of Mules and Men writing like an academic, right? You can't, there's no academic language for the juke joint, right? There's no academic language for telling you how to pull the covers up to keep yourself warm, right? You have to write that like you hear it. Also, think about the science of anthropology and how I mentioned it's very much an outsider viewing a foreign country and imposing their outside lens on that foreign country, on that foreign culture. Zornell Hurston is from this area, right? Like she was born, she lived in that area in Florida and then moved to that area in New Orleans. So they know her personally, right? So she cannot interpret it with authenticity in an academic language. It has to be interpreted in the way that they speak it, right? So to me, the book would lose some of its credibility if it was written in an academic context, right? If it was written with academic language, because someone who's been down south, right? Someone who has historical roots to the South, I know them motherfuckers don't talk like academics, right? Like I know that. Even the academics don't talk like academics like we do here in the West or in the North, right? So you have to remain true to the culture that you're studying if you seek to do anthropological work that is accurate, right? And not objectify those who you're studying. So everybody did a very good job on the breakout groups, but I am curious to hear some other thoughts on the reading, especially for those who haven't said anything so far. So I'm gonna open up to a overall class discussion with the last 10 minutes that we have left. So if you haven't said anything, let's hear your thoughts on the reading. Montserrat, Samantha, Mariana. I know Mariana, actually your mic is down, so no worries. Carissa, for those who have not said anything, let's speak up and be heard.
I have mentioned it in my group, how I kind of compared it to what you said, that like they call their elders dad or father. And in, like, for example, some Hispanics, it's like normal for them to call their parents jefa or jefe, which translates to like boss in English.
Yeah. It's just like a sign of respect, right? Like I respect you, the boss. Yeah, I'm gonna do what you say. Yeah.
And then also, I also know that in French, like for example, they call men monsieur and women mademoiselle, but there's another term to call elders as respect as well.
Yeah. So and it's just this notion of paying respect to those who came before you. And I would say that is a very stark contrast to the way that the Western world views their elders, right? In most indigenous cultures, when the elders get sick, they typically move them in the home with you, right? In African cultures, the elder gets sick, they're being moved into the home with you, right? In a lot of Western cultures, the elder gets sick, they move your ass into the old folks' home, right? So you see the contrast between the way that Native people look at the importance of those who came before them, juxtaposed to the way that the Western culture views those who came before them and try to get them out of the way, right? We put you up in a home so that way you're not interrupting what we have going on. So that's a very good point. Samantha, what did you think about the reading?
I thought that it was very confusing. I didn't really understand much of what she said in the beginning until you started doing a little bit of context. And it was I think the one thing that confused me the most was that she kept jumping stories. So she was talking about bears and lions, and then she jumped to how to eat fish properly, and then she talked, and then somehow a prayer. I think that's what confused me the most.
Yeah. So, and that's a good point, Samantha. But then again, think about it, as I mentioned earlier, though, it's like literally you going to the club and just taking your phone and recording people's conversation. You know what I mean? So depending on where you go, the conversation is going to jump. It's not going to be a fluid, congruent conversation, right? It's going to be broken up. So I agree with you wholeheartedly that that's confusing. That's not the most simplistic read. But when you think about what she's doing, it allows it to make a little bit more sense. Carissa, what were your thoughts on the reading? Carissa? Montserrat, what did you think about the reading?
Just like how she had said, I was pretty confused with the reading because she was jumping from one story to another, and then she ended like talking about the prayer.
But then, like, as we got into the breakout rooms, and then I started to understand it more.
Okay.
But I actually thought it was pretty interesting. And I was thinking, like how I said in how we were talking about my breakout room, that like we all have like different stories and in our different cultures. And I think that like it's pretty interesting how like we all live like all around each other, but we don't know much about each other's culture.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Let me ask the class as an overall question. What do you think is the significance of the sermon towards the end of the chapter? Why do you think that she included that juxtaposed? I mean, outside the fact that it's just something that she recorded, but what do you think is the importance of that? What is the content of the sermon? There's no wrong answers, just your thoughts.
What stood out to me, this was my interpretation of it, of how man is equal to woman, and how she was comparing, oh, it's not a bone from man's head, it's not a bone from, his back, it's from his rib. So I thought that was really important.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you hit it on the head. So one is a sermon about the story of creation, right? How God went about creating things, particularly how he created man and he created women more specifically, right? So if you think about the chapter, what precedes the prayer is the conversation around arguments between men and women, right? Really physical abuse, right? Like, I don't like to see, men and women fighting. I don't like that, right? If you could beat your women and get her in place real quick, then that's cool. But y'all fighting back and forth, I'm not into that, right? So this is the conversation that we're being had prior to the preacher coming on the scene. And then the preacher delivers a sermon that says, just to Cecilia's point, men and women are really equal, right? It's not about women being at the foot of men, right? Or about men being at the head of women. God pulled from the rib, which is at your side, right? So the woman should be at your side, right? So one common thread that we could find between the sermon, the story about how to keep yourself warm, the story about how to eat fish, and the story of the bear and the lion, right? They're stories that make sense of things, right? And then as it pertains specifically to the bear and the lion, right? I mentioned it's a story of subversion. Think about what the bear did and where the bear was when he met the lion, right? The bear had got stabbed up. He's sitting there bleeding, and he heard the lion come, and he thought, oh shit, this lion about to come and eat me, right? So let me come up with something that could keep him from eating me. He tells the story of who is the real king of the jungle. And what that does, or king of the world, that diverts the lion's attention to the man, right? So the bear is now surviving by his intelligence because he made his enemy his enemy's enemy. Y'all with me on that, right? So the person who harmed the bear sent the lion after him, right? That's a double move because now the lion is not after the bear, and now the lion is attacking the person who hurt the bear, right? So he's using his intelligence to do that because he knew I couldn't get into a fight with the lion right now. I'm already injured, right? So the only thing I could do is outwit him. Subversion, right? Then think about the dynamics between the lion and John, right? The lion was on John's ass. John had to pull the strap, right? Shot the lion in the head, shot him in the ass on his way out, right? This is what the story tells. So the way that John was able to, and then, before I go there, think about that dynamic, right? Think about how colonization plays out, right? White man comes into Africa, has to mingle with the chief, right? The chief is like, nah, you're not the king, I'm the king, right? And I'm not gonna allow you to come in here and just run my kingdom the way you so choose. White man had to go back, regroup. He came back with the gun, right? When the gun came into play, the power shifted, right? So at that point, the gun allowed the white man to have power over the king, right? So this is also a story of power dynamics. Whoever has the power is going to be the king of the world, right? And in this case, the gun led them to power. And that's no different than the way that history plays out. If you think about how the Europeans colonized the Americas and the indigenous people, it was the gun. You think about how the Europeans were able to invade Asia, it was the gun. You think about how the Europeans invaded Africa, it was the gun, right? Europeans tried to get into Africa for 200 years unsuccessfully, right? The Africans fought off the Europeans for 200 years until the Europeans came back with that gun. So that's another underlying story that helps the reader make sense of how power is transferred, right? And how whoever becomes the king is the one who holds the gun. There's another little underlying message within that story. All right, so next week we're going to read James Baldwin. It's not as opaque as what we just read. It's a lot more straightforward. It's a little long, so give yourself some time to read it. A little dark, just to let y'all know off jump. It's a little dark and it's a little twisted, and you're gonna be like, Baldwin, what the fuck is wrong with you? But there's a very important story there, and it deals with some very themes as it pertains to this idea of white supremacy, or really white inferiority. So give yourself some time to read through that next this coming week. Once we get done with Baldwin, we'll do a midterm review, and then I'll assign the midterm that week. So next week, let me kind of be accurate with dates. Give me 1 second. So next week, the 15th, we'll cover Baldwin. The 22nd, we'll have our midterm review. I'll email out everybody the midterm on the 23rd. And then that will be due to me by the 27th. So next week, we're covering Baldwin on the 15th. The 22nd, we're gonna have our midterm review. And then you have that midterm due by the 27th. Along with your midterm, turn in your journals as well. And again, we'll recap that as we get closer to the midterm time. We will do the midterm review, but I just kind of want to let you guys know where we're at in the flow of the semester. Is there any other questions that you guys have for me? All right, we'll call it a day, and I'll see you guys next week. If you do have any questions, email me. All right, peace, y'all.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Bye. Thank you, Professor.
Have a good one.
Yeah.
Peace. Jocelyn, you good?
Yes.
Okay. You have any questions, or you okay?
No, I'm okay.
Okay. Have a good one, Jocelyn.